Alright, so the next step of actually weaving with your beads is using the beads. So you have just recently, hopefully, gotten started with wrapping your warp threads on your loom. So now you have your loom with your warp threads all set up and ready to go for your actual weaving. Now at this point you're going to want to make sure you have your pattern available. Unless you're going to wing it, in which case all the more power to you, but it will save you so much time and frustration and effort if you have a pattern available. So as I mentioned before, I have two separate patterns on my page because I have two separate looms that I'm working on. So I'm making sure that I have these ready to go as I'm working. I highly recommend, if you have these little sauce cups at home from takeout places, highly recommend that you use these for your beads while you're working. I was a ding-dong and didn't give you guys any, and I had thought about it, but all things aside, if you have them, I recommend them. You don't need them, but they can be really helpful for having just like beads available. So I'm actually just going to start with the first two colors because I'm going to start you with the first couple rows, and in my pattern my first couple rows only have two colors. So I'm going to pour out some of my red beads, and I'm pouring out some of my orange beads because that's what I'm going to need available for this. And that way I can move other things off to the side and out of distraction. So the other things that you need available are, again, your Nymo D thread. You'll need at least one of your needles, and you'll need a scissor. So just to reiterate, threaded loom with however many warp threads you need. Note, oho, watch, be careful. You need one extra warp thread for how many beads are in your design. You'll also need your beads available. That way you can actually weave them. So when we're working with the weaving part of this process, I'm looking for the end of my thread here, you're going to pull your thread and pull off whatever length you're comfortable working with. I am quite used to beading and bead weaving, so I'm going to pull off really my full arm length. You can try to go that long. You can always use extra thread later. As you're working, the thread can kind of unravel and make it difficult to work with, but it can also be a lot more convenient than trying to weave extra thread. Now, threading the needle. I am just really comfortable with it, and so the best tips I have are really pinch it nice and tight with your off hand and use the needle in your on hand or your writing hand and try to aim the hole in the needle towards the thread. This thread is really fine and light, so it's hard to see, but you can work it in there like that. If it becomes a problem, you can just do a little teeny tiny lick and twist the end in your fingers, and that can help give it more of a point for entering the needle hole or the eye of the needle. Either way, you want to leave yourself just a little bit of a tail for when you're working because you don't want it to pull through as it gets caught on beads. And now, at this point, you're ready to start threading them on. So in my pattern here, I know that it's 9 warps, it's 8 beads across, and my first row is actually just all one color. So picking which side you're going to work from doesn't really matter, just so long as you're working consistently from one end to the other. So I'm going to take my needle, I'm going to take my beads, and I'm going to thread on 8 beads. Okay, so there's 8 beads. And I'm going to take this, and I'm going to take my needle and pass it underneath my warp threads. I don't even have to get close because I know I want it underneath. I'm going to pull these until they are close to the end. Again, I want to leave myself a tail or a little extra thread so that I can weave it back in later. and this time I'm going to leave about 6 inches. And now I'm going to use the tip of my finger, or the pad of my finger, however you want to think of it, and I'm going to push these beads up towards these threads. I'm going to hold them in place so that I can go over my warp threads with my needle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oop, lost these two. Push them back up through. 7 and 8. And I'm going to pull my needle back through, pull my thread so it's nice and tight. You can use your needle to straighten out your pieces. Now, as you go, if your beads are smaller than the spaces between these warp threads, we'll be able to tighten them, and it'll just condense all those beads together and make it a solid design. So as you're going down and you're following your pattern, you're always going to be threading your beads from left to right. So the left side of your design is the beads that'll go on first. This is important so that you're thinking about how you're going to thread your beads into your pattern or from your pattern. So my first row was 8 red. My next row has 7 orange and then 1 red. Got my 7 orange and my 1 red. I'm going to take these, I'm going to put my needle underneath my warp threads. And again, just using my fingertips here, I'm going to space each of these beads out so they each have their own little spot. If you need to, you can kind of come back in with your needle, or if you've got a tweezer. There we go. Again, the key thing is making sure that your needle goes over the warp threads. If you put it through and when you pull tight, if one of your beads falls off, that means that you went back under the warp thread and you effectively went in and out of the bead, and that's what allowed it to fall off. If that happens to you, then you just need to undo that row so you can go back through over the top and then restring your beads and come back through again. That way you make sure that you have your beads on there woven, because again, the way that we do this is going underneath and then over. So the warp threads are holding our beads together. Again, you can pull these tight as you go, and that'll keep it really nice and consistent instead of leaving little spaces between, and this will keep a strong foundation on your piece.